Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we're going to be discussing Brideshead Revisited, which is one of my favorite novels. Now, before we get into this, I want to talk a little bit about why I started this channel and kind of the idea behind it. So, I'm a writer. I've written short stories, novels for basically the past 15 years or so. My debut novel, Portrait of Sebastian Khan, came out in 2019. So I have a lot of experience writing, and one thing that I know has always helped me as a writer is reading the classics. And so what I wanted to do with this channel was basically share the books that inspired me, the books that made me the writer that I am today, and the books that I think everyone should be reading, the classics that I believe deserve a place in our culture, especially these days with AI usage increasing in schools, with people reading less and less than they used to. I feel like doing something like this is really important. Getting people to read books, trying to explain to people why they should read books, and essentially just discussing the kinds of books that have moved me deeply. You know, even if I wasn't a writer, even if I never wrote anything in my life, these books would still have meaning to me. And so I'm going to discuss why that is, why you should read these books, and what you might get out of them. Now, one thing to note is we're going to be talking a lot about the endings of these novels, because in a lot of cases, the reason they're worth reading is how the books end, the feeling they leave you with. So that presents us with a little bit of a paradox, right? How can I encourage you to read these books if you haven't already by spoiling them for you? Well, I've often said that I don't think spoilers are a reason not to read a book. Sometimes you might know the ending of a book, but it's the experience of reading it that moves you, not the ending itself. So whether you're a new reader who's looking to discover new books, whether you're someone who loves these books and just wants to hear them discussed, welcome. Let's dive into Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. So Evelyn Waugh, just to give you some context, he's a British writer from the 20th century. He is not aristocratic himself, but the milieu that he writes about is definitely a more aristocratic one. He was known for he has a reputation of being a little bit of a snob, right? He was a successful writer at the time. He wrote a lot of books. Brideshead Revisited, he wrote in 1945. It's one of his later novels. So he was born in 1903, so he would have been, in his 40s when he wrote this. The context for his writing Brideshead Revisited is important. So Evelyn Waugh served in World War II, but when he was older, right, when he was in his 40s. And so the novel, in many ways, is the product of someone who grew up in a certain social world, right? The world of the 20s and the 30s, and then watched that world disappear. And the novel basically explores what it's like to lose something that you valued a lot. To some extent, you could say it's about youth and the passing of youth, the fading of youth. But what makes the novel so brilliant is that Evelyn Waugh connects the aging of his own character, Charles Ryder, with essentially the aging of England, right? With the passing of this certain, we could say, aristocratic world that was there when he grew up and that disappeared at the end of World War II. The basic story of Brideshead Revisited is pretty simple. Actually, before we dive into it, I do want to say one thing about the publication, which is important to note. Evelyn Waugh wrote this novel in 1945, but then he famously revised the novel again in 1960. And in his revisions, he actually took out a lot of the beautiful, lush, descriptive passages that made this novel such a sensation, and that made this novel so different from some of the previous things that he'd worked on. Now, the edition that I have is from 1945, is the original version. Most likely, right, if you buy this book at a bookstore, you're going to get the 1960 version. That's okay. A lot of the passages are very similar. So even when I quote from this version, right, you'll be able to follow along if you have the 1960 version. Now, you can also find the text of the 1945 version online, right? Because it's public domain. So I recommend reading the 1945 version. I feel that it's superior in many ways, but I think you're going to get the same experience even if you have his revised version from 1960. All right, so I want to start by just sketching out the plot of Brideshead Revisited, and then I want to take a deep dive into the opening few chapters, which really set the tone and which are some of the most famous sections of Brideshead, the sections where Waugh's writing really comes to life, and that are deservedly the sections that have given Evelyn Waugh his reputation as a writer. So the context of the novel is pretty simple, right? We actually open in the Second World War, during the Second World War, and our protagonist, Charles Ryder, is basically, an older, middle-aged man at this point, and he is in the army. He's serving in this battalion, and the prologue is actually kind of, to be honest, a little difficult to get through because Evelyn Waugh is depicting life in the army as drudgery, and some of this is kind of reflected in the way he writes. Charles Ryder is very unhappy in the prologue, but the prologue ends with Ryder and his battalion arriving at Brideshead Castle, which is basically the estate that gives the novel its title and where most of the novel's action takes place. And once he comes back to Brideshead, basically at this point it's been kind of requisitioned by the British Army during the war, and that itself is an important symbol. We're going to return to this when we discuss the ending of the novel. But it's been requisitioned by the British Army, and upon returning here, Charles has this recollection. And basically that takes us into the novel itself. And so the first section is Charles's life as a student at Oxford. And the primary storyline here is his friendship, and we're going to put that in quotes because, it's a little bit more than friendship, as we're going to see. His friendship with Sebastian Flight, the son of basically the lord and lady of Brideshead Castle. And this friendship, right, Charles's friendship with Sebastian, is going to be the driving, animating force of the novel. Charles, as we're going to see, is a middle class person, much like Waugh himself in many ways, with a slightly distant father figure, a mother who died during World War I. So he has a certain loneliness, a certain alienation. And Sebastian, meanwhile, is Catholic. He's an aristocrat. He comes from a big family. He's very wealthy. And Charles essentially falls in love with Sebastian, but also with Sebastian's entire family. His sister Julia, his other sister Cordelia, even to some extent some of Sebastian's parents, who we meet in the first section. So that's essentially how the novel is set up, right? The story of this friendship between Charles Ryder and Sebastian Flight and his larger family, right? The Marchmains of Brideshead. But I want to take a moment to look at the opening chapter of part one of the novel, the section that's set in Oxford, because this is the section where I think we really see Evelyn Waugh's writing come alive. And I think as a reader, when you read this opening section, it's hard to put the book down. When you read this opening section, you lose yourself in the world that Evelyn Waugh has created, this incredible, beautiful world. So I just want to read the opening paragraph here. "I have been here before," I said. I had been there before. First with Sebastian, more than 20 years ago, on a cloudless day in June, when the ditches were white with fool's parsley and meadowsweet, and the air heavy with all the scents of summer. It was a day of peculiar splendor, such as our climate affords once or twice a year, when leaf and flower and bird and sunlit stone and shadow seem all to proclaim the glory of God. And though I had been there so often, in so many moods, it was to that first visit that my heart returned on this, my latest. So Charles is recalling not the last time he'd been to Brideshead, but the first time he'd been to Brideshead. And just notice the way he writes this description, especially after, you have to imagine this comes after a rather dreary prologue set in kind of army barracks. Here he's describing the, cloudless day in June, the ditches white with fool's parsley and meadowsweet, the air heavy with all the scents of summer. When Evelyn Waugh wants to write about sensory experience, he's very good at it. He's very good at conveying, especially through details of smell, this kind of heady atmosphere. And that atmosphere is really what makes this novel so unique. The completely lush, kind of almost overwrought romanticism of some of the descriptions, they're very haunting, and they stick with you long after you've stopped reading. So if we keep reading, this next paragraph is when he really evokes Oxford, right? And that's the other thing this novel is known for, a depiction of Oxford that's particularly kind of glamorous. That day, too, I had come, not knowing my destination. It was Eights Week. Oxford, submerged now and obliterated, irrecoverable as lioness, so quickly have the waters come flooding in. Lioness, by the way, is like a little allusion. I think English people might know it more. It's kind of like an Atlantis-like kind of city. Essentially, the idea is it's a place that's long gone. Oxford in those days was still a city of aqua tint. In her spacious and quiet streets, men walked and spoke as they had done in Newman's day. Her autumnal mists, her gray springtime, and the rare glory of her summer days, such as that day, when the chestnut was in flower, and the bells rang out high and clear over her gables and cupolas, exhaled the soft vapors of 1,000 years of learning. It was this cloistral hush which gave our laughter its resonance, and carried it still joyously over the intervening clamor. So again, just notice the sensory details that he uses to evoke this mood in Oxford, right? The city of aqua tint, the quiet streets, the autumnal mists, the rare glory of her summer days, the chestnut in flower, the bells ringing out, the soft vapors of 1,000 years of learning. Now this is incredible writing, a series of sensory details piled on top of each other to create a really magical, evocative atmosphere. And this is really the atmosphere of the first section of the book, this heightened, heady, misty, kind of beautiful, nostalgic, dreamy atmosphere. Okay, so the other section that I want to quote from the first chapter, so he's invited essentially to Sebastian's rooms, right? Sebastian, pukes all over the flowers outside Charles's window, and as a recompense, he invites Charles for lunch. And this is how Charles kind of gains entry into this world. But notice the passage that Evelyn Waugh writes to describe Charles's entry into this world. I went there uncertainly, for it was foreign ground, and there was a tiny priggish warning voice in my ear, which in the tones of Collins told me it was seemly to hold back. So Collins is his intellectual friend, who sort of represents the intellectual side of college in contrast to Sebastian, who represents the aesthetic side of college. And of course, Charles is more drawn to Sebastian, more drawn to the aesthetic side than to Collins's intellectualism. But I was in search of love in those days, and I went full of curiosity and the faint, unrecognized apprehension that here at last I should find that low door in the wall, which others I knew had found before me, which opened on an enclosed and enchanted garden, which was somewhere, not overlooked by any window, in the heart of that gray city. So that passage that's the incredible passage that really summarizes the emotional shift that Charles experiences at the beginning of Brideshead. Up to this point, he's felt slightly alone at Oxford, slightly alienated. He's getting advice from lots of different people, and he's not sure, right, who to trust. It's a feeling that a lot of us have when we go to college, this sense that here is this great world, but it's where exactly are we supposed to go? And the way Charles describes what he experiences here, he feels as though he has gone through a low door in a wall that leads him essentially into what he describes as an enchanted garden. And the line I think that's really important here is that low door in the wall which others I knew had found before me. So he is sort of aware that what he's discovering here through Sebastian is a sort of access almost to a secret society. Now, some people have interpreted this passage as being essentially a veiled reference to Charles's sexuality, right? That what he's describing here, because Evelyn Waugh himself was gay, what he's describing here essentially is this feeling of having discovered kind of this secret world where he can be himself, especially at a time when being gay, was frowned upon in society, to say the least. And so this is, you could interpret as a sort of a veiled description of Charles kind of discovering sort of through Sebastian his sexuality. But even if you want to interpret the novel differently, in a way what he's describing here is just an entree into a new way of looking at the world. Because that's going to be the transformation that Charles experiences over the course of the novel. He's going to go from a relatively conventional person at the beginning of the novel, a conventional 20th century young man. By the end of the novel, as we're going to see, he's going to become someone vastly different. He's going to become someone who recognizes that the past might actually have more greatness, more beauty, more of value than the present. That there is something beyond the 20th century. And in a way, Sebastian is Charles's entry into this new worldview, because Sebastian and all he represents is that link to the past, right? The English aristocracy, Catholicism, all of those things that for middle class atheistic Charles represent the old world, represent the world that in the 20th century he sort of wondered whether that world even existed anymore. So perhaps that low door in the wall and that enchanted garden is more than just Charles's own identity, but a kind of deeper connection to the past that this new friendship with Sebastian gives him access to. All right, so I want to jump ahead now because there's a lot of great passages in this novel, and especially in this opening section. We could talk for a long time. But the main conflict of the novel starts to settle on Sebastian's alcoholism, because that is essentially the thing that holds Sebastian back, right? He is first introduced to Charles as someone who pukes on the flowers outside his garden because he's so drunk. And, alcoholism, which in college was a sort of, fun lark almost, becomes something much more serious when the characters leave Oxford and enter the real world. And sort of the middle section of the novel, really in kind of the end of the first part, really deals with Sebastian's alcoholism and, the difficulties that brings in. At the same time, we're then introduced to a whole series of other characters. Essentially, each of Sebastian's siblings gets a section of the novel that really kind of focuses on them. Sebastian's two siblings are Julia and Cordelia. Julia is sort of more important. Julia is around Sebastian's age, and in a way, what ends up happening in the novel is that Charles channels his frustrated feelings around Sebastian towards Julia. He sort of triangulates his desire for Sebastian onto Julia, who represents a more kind of traditional, because she's a woman and Charles is a man, a more traditional and expected romantic path for him. At the same time, so Julia herself, in the middle of the novel, ends up getting married to a Canadian businessman named Rex Mottram. So Rex Mottram is I believe, one of the more entertaining characters that Evelyn Waugh has written. A lot of this has to do with the dialogue, right? Evelyn Waugh has an ear for dialogue, and he really captures this sort of brutish, brash, aggressive, cocky voice through the character of Rex. Now, one thing I've talked about a lot in my creative writing classes is how a great supporting character, their function in a novel is not the same thing as a great protagonist. So Rex Mottram does not have the same, deep inner life that Charles has. He does not have the same dramatic sort of character arc. Instead, a great supporting character like Rex needs to be symbolic of certain key themes and ideas. And Rex is clearly a symbol of the 20th century. He is clearly a symbol of the New World. He is a man of business. He eventually becomes a significant politician, or at least connected, right, to the political circles of England. He's new money, we could say. And in some ways, Julia's mother, right, disapproves of her marrying Rex, especially when she learns that Rex had been married once before, which is, of course, a big faux pas in Catholicism. At the same time, right, Rex represents this kind of modernity, this newness. And there's a very entertaining scene in the middle of the novel, right, when Charles basically has dinner with Rex. And this is one of my favorite sections, because it's sort of a scene where, not a lot happens, right? During this dinner, he and Rex are basically talking about Rex's marriage to Julia, about the family, right, all these sorts of things. But there is a particular passage, a really beautiful passage, where Charles starts reflecting on Rex through the context of the meal that they're having at this restaurant. So basically, Rex decides to take Charles out to this really nice restaurant. And this is an interesting passage because when Evelyn Waugh edited the novel in the 1960s, right, in the 1960 edition, this was one of the passages that he actually cut. So if you have the 1960 edition, you might not see the same level of description as I'm about to read here. I actually think this passage, not to criticize Evelyn Waugh for editing his own novel, but I really don't think he should have cut this passage because it really is, I think, the key thematic idea of the novel. And it's contained in this conversation between Charles and a relatively minor character. So they're having dinner, and they're being served this type of wine, right, this Burgundy. And Charles starts rhapsodizing about how beautiful the wine is, how exquisite it tastes. So this is on page 175 of my edition, right, kind of right in the middle of the novel. I rejoiced in the Burgundy. How can I describe it? The pathetic fallacy resounds in all our praise of wine. For centuries, every language has been strained to define its beauty, and has produced only wild conceits, or the stock epithets of the trade. This Burgundy seemed to me then serene and triumphant, a reminder that the world was an older and better place than Rex knew, that mankind in its long passion had learned another wisdom than his. So those lines, I think, really capture what Evelyn Waugh is trying to say, not just in that passage, but in the entire novel. So I like the way he sets that up, right? He sort of begins by saying, a lot of people have not done a great job describing wine. It's hard to describe wine without sounding just kind of cliche. This is sort of, he's setting himself up because he's about to give what I think is one of the best descriptions of wine we've ever seen in a novel. He doesn't really even focus on the taste or the smell or any of those sensory details, even though he could, right? We have seen Evelyn Waugh do an excellent job with sensory detail. But instead, he starts identifying what does the Burgundy symbolize to him. And it symbolizes, as he says here, an older and better world than Rex with his wisdom knew. Remember, Rex is the man of the century, the man of the current century, of the 20th century. He's a businessman. He is assertive. He is confident. Earlier in the novel, he successfully helped Sebastian avoid jail time after a drunk driving incident. But what Charles recognizes wisely here is that Rex does not understand the deeper aesthetic values of culture. And that's what the wine represents for him. And so, in the novel as a whole, right, and we're going to talk about the ending in a moment, in the novel as a whole, Charles's overall transformation is one in which he becomes more conscious of these older, kind of more essential values that predate the 20th century and that he believes will continue long after, right, World War II has ravaged the European continent, has ravaged the world. And so this paragraph about the wine, incidental though it may seem, I really think it encapsulates the true essence of the book. This reverence for old things, this reverence for things from the past, which is in many ways why this novel resonates so much. Because rarely do you get a novel that is so assured in its ideas about the relationship between the present and the past. Evelyn Waugh knows exactly how he feels about our modern world, or his modern world, we could say. And he knows exactly how he feels about the past and how much he longs for it. And he conveys it so beautifully in this passage and in the whole novel. So then let's jump to the ending, right? There's a lot of great stuff we could talk about for the ending of Brideshead Revisited, but I want to focus on, a few key passages. So the tension in the third part of the novel is no longer the tension in the first two. Now it's less about Sebastian and Charles. Sebastian is essentially off screen by this point, off the page by this point. Instead, the tension is around Charles and Julia. Charles has essentially triangulated his desire for Sebastian onto Julia. But the ending of the third part of the novel comes down to a character who we've seen once before, and that is Sebastian and Julia's father, Lord Marchmain. And the events that basically lead to the final chapters is that Lord Marchmain is dying, and he decides to come back to Brideshead to do this. Now, Lord Marchmain has been set up by Evelyn Waugh throughout the novel as an atheist, sort of a man who is not religious. His wife, the woman he married, was the religious one, was the Catholic one. So Catholicism comes from his wife's side of the family, not his. And the big turn at the end of the novel, however, is that in the final pages of the last chapter, as Lord Marchmain is dying, he decides to convert to Catholicism. He makes a sign indicating his assent to hear the last rites. And this sort of miraculous final conversion is essentially the event that leads to Charles and Julia breaking up. Because Julia is so moved by the sight of her father converting in these final moments that she realizes that she too has to return to her faith, return to Catholicism. And remember, Catholicism, right, does not allow divorce. So if she is a true Catholic, she cannot divorce Rex and marry Charles. And so at the end of the novel, when this happens, this is basically the end of Charles's hopes. And he has to accept that he's not marrying into this family, he's not marrying Julia, that he will not be a part of this world anymore. Now, a lot of people have criticized this part of the ending. They've often said, well, it seems a little bit forced. It seems a little bit unrealistic that Lord Marchmain suddenly converts. It feels miraculous in a way that's unrealistic. But what I want to argue is that it's not really that unexpected. And Evelyn Waugh does a very intelligent job setting up this final conversion of Lord Marchmain. And the key passage I want to look at occurs in the final chapter of the novel, where Lord Marchmain has come back to die, a few pages from the end. So it's a passage where he is reflecting on the house, reflecting on the castle, reflecting on Brideshead, the estate. So I'm just going to read out loud here, and then we'll talk about why I think this passage is Waugh's way of preparing us for Lord Marchmain's conversion, for the events of the end of the novel. Next to death, perhaps because they are like death, he feared darkness and loneliness. He liked to have us in his room, and the lights burnt all night among the gilt figures. He did not wish us to speak much, but he talked himself, so quietly that we could often not hear him. He talked, I think, because his was the only voice he could trust, when it assured him that he was still alive. What he said was not for us, nor for any ears but his own. So that passage is simply to set up Lord Marchmain's final monologue. So that's essentially what I'm going to read. And I want us to pay attention to what this monologue is about and how it prefigures Marchmain's conversion in the final pages of the book. Better today, I can see now, in the corner of the fireplace, where the mandarin is holding his gold bell, and the crooked tree is in flower below his feet, where yesterday I was confused, and took the little tower for another man. Soon I shall see the bridge and the 3 storks, and know where the path leads over the hill. So he's simply describing what he sees and sort of acknowledging that, yes, I'm seeing things clearly now. I am no longer kind of muddled. So he's sort of acknowledging on a literal sense that he is better today, as in he's not sick anymore. But in a way, this clarity is also a kind of spiritual clarity that he's experiencing here. So continuing on. Better tomorrow. We live long in our family and marry late. 73 is no age. Aunt Julia, my father's aunt, now that's not the same Julia as the one Charles is going to marry, obviously, but she has the same name, which is significant. Aunt Julia, my father's aunt, lived to be 88, born and died here, never married, saw the fire on Beacon Hill for the Battle of Trafalgar, always called it the New House. That was the name they had for it in the nursery and in the fields when unlettered men had long memories. You can see where the old house stood near the village church. They call the field Castle Hill. Horlick's field where the ground's uneven and half of it is waste, nettle and briar and hollows too deep for ploughing. They dug to the foundations to carry the stone for the new house, a house that was a century old when Aunt Julia was born. Those were our roots in the waste hollows of Castle Hill, in the briar and nettle, among the tombs in the old church and the chantry where no clerk sings. So he's describing here essentially the building of Brideshead Castle, or what they call the new house. And he links this to Trafalgar, to some key events in English history. He basically describes how his father's aunt, Aunt Julia, was old enough to have seen the fire on Beacon Hill for the Battle of Trafalgar. So he is essentially reminding us that this is an ancient family. This is an old family. This is a family with historic roots in England. And he then describes the way in which, right, the old house was demolished to build the new house. And he seems to be reflecting on the significance of the old house and on his roots in the soil of England. Aunt Julia knew the tombs. Cross-legged knight and doubleted earl, marquis like a Roman senator, limestone, alabaster, and Italian marble, tapped the escutcheons with her ebony cane, made the cask ring over old Sir Roger. We were knights then, barons since Agincourt. The large honours came with the Georges. They came the last and they'll go the first. The barony descends in the female line. When Brideshead is buried, he married late, Julia's son will be called by the name his fathers bore before the fat days, the days of wool shearing in the wide cornlands, the days of growth and building, when the marshes were drained and the waste land brought under the plough. When one built the house, his son added the dome, his son spread the wings and dammed the river. Aunt Julia watched them build the fountain. It was old before it came here, weathered 200 years by the sun of Naples, brought by man o' war in the days of Nelson. Soon the fountain will be dry till the rain fills it, setting the fallen leaves afloat in the basin, and over the lakes the reeds will spread and close. Better today. So again, he's reflecting on history. He's reflecting on the history of his family. We were knights then, he says. He reminds us that he can trace his lineage back to Agincourt, the great battle that defines Englishness, right? Henry V defeating the French. Shakespeare wrote about it. It's a essential historical event in English history. Again, think of the references he's making. Agincourt, Trafalgar, great moments of English victory. He is trying to root his family in a certain English tradition. And he seems to implicitly recognize that this English tradition is on its way out. He describes the fountain, which is an important symbol. Fountain brought from Naples, right, with all these European historic associations. And he emphasizes that soon the fountain will be dry, right? That tells us where Lord Marchmain's head is at. He is thinking about the end of things. He is thinking about his own death, but implicitly also the death of this aristocratic world that he has been the inheritor of, and that he fears he may be the last inheritor of. Not in a literal sense, but just in a thematic sense, that the world will no longer be passed down because that world is gone or is going away. Continuing on. Better today. I have lived carefully,
sheltered myself from the cold winds, eaten moderately of what was in season, drunk fine claret, slept in my own sheets. I shall live long. I was 50 when they dismounted us and sent us into the line. Old men stay at the base, the orders said, but Walter Venables, my commanding officer, my nearest neighbor, said, "You're as fit as the youngest of them, Alex." So I was. So I am now, if I could only breathe. He's talking here about World War I. He was 50 during World War I, and he emphasizes that he still was sent to the line, even though he was 50. Now, World War I is, of course, the beginning of the end of this aristocratic world. World War II, of course, will be the final end. No air, no wind stirring under the velvet canopy. No one has opened the door for 1,000 years in Aladdin's treasury, deep underground where the jinns burrow like moles and no wind stirs. When the summer comes, said Lord Marchmain, oblivious of the deep corn and swelling fruit, and the surfeited bees who slowly sought their hives in the heavy afternoon sunlight outside his windows. When the summer comes, I shall leave my bed and sit in the open air and breathe more easily. Better tomorrow, when the wind comes down the valley, and a man can turn to meet it and fill himself with air like a beast at water. Who would have thought that all these little gold men, gentlemen in their own country, could live so long without breathing, like toads in the coal, down a deep mine, untroubled? God take it, why have they dug a hole for me? Must a man stifle to death in his own cellars? Plunder, Gaston, open the windows. The windows are all open, my lord. I know them. I was born in this house. They open from a cellar into a tunnel. It can only be done by gunpowder. Bore the rock, cram it with powder, trace the fuse, crouch under cover around the corner while we touch it off. We'll blast our way to daylight. So that is an extraordinary monologue of a man on his deathbed, sort of reminiscing about the past, about his family's history, and then sort of drifting into a strange reverie about blasting open, right, the house towards daylight. It's quite the image to represent a man approaching death, a man losing his sense of understanding, losing his sense of the world. But I think it speaks to the deeper psychological feelings in Lord Marchmain, right? This is a man who recognizes all the things that Waugh has taught us to recognize at this point in the novel, all the things that Charles has also recognized, that the modern world is no place for men like Lord Marchmain, right? The modern world is not the world of Brideshead. It is the world that Charles will soon inhabit, the world of gunpowder, the world of explosions, the world of war. And Lord Marchmain seems to be recognizing that. In his kind of rambling monologue, he recognizes the essential truth that with his death, the world too will be dying. And so let's imagine a man with these feelings in his heart, with this pessimism in his heart, when the opportunity arises to convert to Catholicism, a faith that represents the old world in a way that few other things do, of course he would convert. And I think, obviously, if you're not Catholic, I'm not Catholic, but if you're not Catholic, maybe you don't believe that about Catholicism. But you have to remember, what was Catholicism's symbolic role to people of this generation? Evelyn Waugh is not the only one who converted to Catholicism and who wrote novels about this conversion. There are many famous writers who underwent something similar. Graham Greene, right, is the other big example. This seemed to be a common experience for a lot of people who lived through World War II in the way that Evelyn Waugh did. And what he's doing here is he is trying to put those feelings of his own into this monologue of this old dying aristocrat in order to kind of explain why he converts. Now, that of course is not the end of the novel. There is one more scene that I want to discuss, which has to do with Charles. The final moment of Charles's transformation then occurs at the very end of the novel, in the epilogue, when we return to
the world of the military, the barracks, the grim and bleak world of World War II when Charles is back in Brideshead, right? Having essentially, as we've seen throughout the novel, lost everything, right? Lost his friendship with Sebastian, right? Lost potential relationship with Julia. But the very end of the novel, he goes back to the chapel, the Brideshead Chapel. And this chapel is very significant. He first visited this chapel with Sebastian at the very beginning. Later, he paints the chapel, right? So Charles's job, which we haven't really touched on, Charles is a painter. He's an architectural painter, slightly conservative kind of style of painter. And as he says in the novel, some of his best paintings were basically the paintings he did in Brideshead. So he goes back to the chapel, and he notices, basically. So I want to just read the last section. It's a bit long, but I think it's important to read the whole thing here, to really understand how Evelyn Waugh ends this novel. There was one part of the house I had not yet visited, and I went there now. The chapel showed no ill effects of its long neglect. The Art Nouveau paint was as fresh and bright as ever. The Art Nouveau lamp burned once more before the altar. I said a prayer, an ancient, newly learned form of words, and left, turning towards the camp. And as I walked back, and the cookhouse bugle sounded ahead of me, I thought... Now, we're going to get into his long sort of reflection here in a moment, but notice what he does there. He goes into the chapel. He sees that there's a lamp that's still burning. This is an important symbol for Waugh at the end, right? The idea of a lamp that continues to burn in the chapel. That even through World War II, this old lamp, this Art Nouveau lamp, continues to burn. And Charles basically prays in front of it. And look at the way that prayer is phrased. I said a prayer, an ancient, newly learned form of words. So it's an ancient prayer. The idea is it's an old prayer. He doesn't explicitly say it's a Catholic prayer. It could even be something older than that. The point is not necessarily Catholicism itself, but the old world. The idea of something ancient that Charles is saying here, that Charles is invoking here. And for Charles, it is a newly learned form of words. Charles, the atheist, has now become, you could say, religious. So this is the final transformation. Now let's look at the next passage where he reflects on the flame. The builders did not know the uses to which their work would descend. They made a new house with the stones of the old castle. Year by year, generation after generation, they enriched and extended it. Year by year, the great harvest of timber in the park grew to ripeness, until in sudden frost came the age of Hooper. Hooper is one of the soldiers in the army, in basically his battalion. So Hooper represents, again, the new world, the modern world. So for Evelyn Waugh, the age of Hooper is the age of World War II, the age of modernity. The place was desolate, and the work all brought to nothing. Quomodo sedat sola civitas. It's a Latin phrase that means sort of how lonely the city stands. It's this reflection on sort of the passing of things that has happened, that has occurred earlier in the novel. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. So he's talking in that paragraph about how everything has declined, right? The builders of Brideshead had no idea what was going to happen to the place they built. No idea that it was going to become a barracks in the future, a sort of place for soldiers in World War II to be quartered. And yet, I thought, stepping out more briskly towards the camp, where the bugles, after a pause, had taken up the second call, and were resounding, pick 'em up, hot potatoes. And yet that is not the last word. It is not even an apt word. It is a dead word from 10 years back. So the word he's thinking of is vanity, and he realizes he's wrong to think of it as vanity, right? The people who built Brideshead kind of being vain to think that their building would last. Now notice the sensory details here in this paragraph. He's listening to the bugles. He's listening to this very kind of modern song, right, that's being played. Pick 'em up, hot potatoes. This kind of, these sensory details of modernity are now going to be contrasted with, of course, the ancient idea that Charles has now learned to love. So last paragraph now. Something quite remote from anything the builders intended has come out of their work, and out of the fierce little human tragedy in which I played. Something none of us thought about at the time. A small red flame, a beaten copper lamp of deplorable design, relit before the beaten copper doors of a tabernacle. The flame which the old knights saw from their tombs, which they saw put out. That flame burns again for other soldiers, far from home, farther in heart than Acre or Jerusalem. It could not have been lit but for the builders and the tragedians, and there I found it this morning, burning anew among the old stones. So, what is he talking about here? He's talking about the flame that he saw, right, in that Art Nouveau lamp. But it's not just that flame, because for Evelyn Waugh, that flame represents a tradition that goes back to the knights in Jerusalem, to the Crusaders, to even further back. And, he's linking, I think he's thinking of the Crusaders because he's thinking of soldiers, right? Because he has now become a soldier in a war. And so what he's doing here is he's realizing that the flame that he sees in the church that is burning is a symbol of a long tradition that for him goes all the way back to the Crusaders at Jerusalem. And this gives him a new sense of purpose almost. He sort of realizes that he is not in a world in which everything has decayed, right? Earlier he had talked about the vanity of the builders. Now he's saying, no, it was not vanity. Because whatever the builders intended, something more came from it. He's essentially saying that there is a meaning that the builders did not even realize they were evoking when they built this place. A meaning that is, of course, this flame that goes all the way back. And now look at the last two lines. I quickened my pace and reached the hut which served us for our anteroom. You're looking unusually cheerful today, said the second in command. So he's now cheerful at the end because he realizes suddenly that, yes, he might be a soldier in this ugly, terrible war, in this terrible barracks, in this house that had once represented beauty to him, but there is something deeper at play here, right? He's connected himself to a deeper tradition. And this, I think, is the true brilliance of Brideshead Revisited. The reason, right, that it sticks with us. Because what Evelyn Waugh is saying, essentially, is that there is some deeper tradition that we are connected to. And no matter how brutal the modern world becomes, that tradition does not go away. And honestly, I find that to be a beautiful sentiment. I mean, especially today, because the world has changed now in ways that Evelyn Waugh could never have imagined, right? We're well beyond, right, the 20th century. We have technology that seems like it is destroying all human culture. And that's, again, it goes back to why I'm making this channel to start with and why I wanted to start with Brideshead Revisited, because I think this book is essentially arguing that there is something valuable in tradition. And I certainly believe that as a writer and as a reader who loves these classic works. And that's going to be in some ways the spirit of this entire channel is I want to rescue and keep alive the tradition in the face of the modern world, the contemporary world. In a way, what moves me so much is I realize when I'm reading this novel and when I'm talking to you guys about this novel is that I can feel that flame that he's describing. I can feel it as if it's still lit, right? Reading this book keeps that flame alive. Talking about this book keeps that flame alive. And that's what we're trying to do here. That's what I think as readers and writers and as lovers of culture we need to do. And Evelyn Waugh, a very bitter and tortured man, but a very wise man, took that idea and incorporated it into a really beautiful novel, a really tragic and sad novel, but a really beautiful novel. And I think that's what stays with us. When we think about this novel now and reflect on it more broadly, like what stays with us? Why is this novel a classic? Why is this novel worth reading? 75 years after it was published. Obviously, I think the thing that people take is the pathos of Charles and Sebastian's relationship. And, there's the famous 1980s version with Jeremy Irons, which really leans into the kind of the tragedy, right, of their love story. That is, I think, a great reason to read the novel, to really just feel that level of emotion. But I think it's deeper than just their relationship, because I think their relationship and Charles's love for Sebastian is really about Charles discovering an older aesthetic world, an older world of culture, and that's really what he's falling in love with when he falls in love with Sebastian, when he falls in love with Brideshead, when later he tries to start a relationship with Julia. All right, so thank you everyone for listening. That concludes our first episode on Brideshead Revisited. If you liked what you heard, please share the podcast with people, spread the word. Next week, we're going to be shifting gears a little bit, moving away from the aristocratic world of England and into 20th century America with Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. It's one of my favorite novels, so it'll be a great episode. Make sure you tune in, and I'll see you all next time.